For this podcast, we're going to look at the book of Daniel. And there are a few parts of the Bible that are my favorite for many different reasons. And there are some characters that are my favorite characters. Uh, my favorite characters in the Bible probably are Joseph, Jonathan, Daniel, Matthew, James. Those probably would be my uh, favorite characters in the Bible. So I am very pleased to have this conversation about Daniel. Daniel is one of the very few characters, you know what, maybe the only. I believe Daniel is the only character in the Bible where we engage in a story of their life and their ministry and what they've done. Daniel is the only character in the Bible that didn't have some flaw or mistake that also was part of his story. And in some ways, uh, the flaws of these characters uh, may not lessen what we think and feel about them. In reality, what it shows us is that uh, uh, all of us have flaws. All of us make mistakes or have made mistakes. And uh, in our lives, God can still use us for the better good of God's people, of humanity, our communities. And so while it is good to see that even though Abraham made some mistakes and Joseph made some mistakes, Jacob made some mistakes, um, King David made some mistakes. Even though we see these mistakes that the people did, even Peter, uh, Saul, who became Paul, they made some mistakes. Uh, James and his brother John, two of the disciples, made some mistakes. Irritated Jesus, I'm sure, at some point. Daniel is a character that I have not found any reference in any writing or any scripture, any text that says anything less than ideal about this person, Daniel. Now, um, Daniel becomes important to the story when Babylon takes over um, the kingdom of Judah and captures the king and puts the king's uncle in charge of Judah, but uh, later uh, he is gotten rid of. But at the time that they took over, they wanted to take the young princes or the ones who would likely be king next, or who likely could rise up a revolution and an army to try and attack Babylon. And so they took uh, the four most likely candidates, four princes, uh, to Babylon, and they were who we know as Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were their Babylonian names. Daniel's Babylonian name was Belshazzar. Um, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's names were Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now, granted, I read and study English versions of the Bible, and a lot of these names were anglicized. So uh, we're just going to assume that these are the real names or are very close to them. But their names in Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and they were four princes of Judah that were targeted for capture and were taken to Babylon. They were descendants of King David and would have been possible heirs to the throne following the removal of King Jehoiakim and very shortly King Zedekiah. Uh, it's important to note that these four princes were selected not just because they were princes, but also because they were very good-looking young men. They were smart and pretty, which were the requirements of visible service to King Nebuchadnezzar. Like, not only did he want these four captured, but he wanted them, King Nebuchadnezzar wanted him in his palace and in his service. Um, uh, King Nebuchadnezzar, King Nebuchadnezzar wanted uh, his attendants or the people that were nearest and closest to him in his service to be good looking. It was important to him that they were intelligent and smart. And so not only were these four princes uh, intelligent and smart, but they were good looking. They were fine examples of men. And maybe on some level, King Nebuchadnezzar thought, this really shows my power if I took over the country and look at these good examples of uh, their top male physique right there in their land. So there were reasons that the king wanted them. So in the King James version of the Bible, they say that these four princes were taken to be educated and trained by Aspenus, who was uh, the 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 master of the eunuchs, or was in charge of the eunuchs. Now, when we look in some of the more modern um, day versions of the Bible, they didn't want to use the word eunuch. Um, the New International Version and even the NRSV and the NRSV UE, they don't call him the master of the eunuchs or the trainer of the eunuchs, the person who was in charge of the eunuchs, but they talk about he was chief of his court officials, the chief of his court officials. Now, his court officials would have been traditionally eunuchs. These would have been young men, young boys, really, that were 5, 6, and 7, who were castrated. Their testicles were removed. And then as they continued to grow, they would grow as eunuchs. And that having happened before puberty, uh, their sexual drive and interest just wouldn't be there. That's kind of what happens if you are a male without testicles. They do that with horses, called it geldings. And they talk about, even in the horse world, uh, geldings, uh, they prefer for them to be gelded, castrated, around 1 year of age. Um, 1 year of age in horse terms is probably about 9 or 10, I guess. And that is because the body has started to fully grow and develop, but the the hormones have not hit to the point where their interest in the female horses, the mares, has started really to define their behaviors. Um, and a horse that has been gelded around 1 year of age will be milder and more gentle than if you wait until a horse is 5 or 6 years and then geld them. Okay. I hate to talk about horses when I'm talking about, but we know some things about horses and raising horses, and when is the ideal time to geld them. The same thing when they captured uh, males that they were going to use as servants. If they wanted uh, them to be educated and be trusted around all of their family, they would castrate them and make them eunuchs. Now, uh, while I am studying Matthew here, even in my book Deep and Wide, I do take a little diversion there and talk about some scriptures in Matthew where Matthew talks about eunuchs and what they were. A eunuch at that time was a male that was not suitable for marriage, and they recognized that some of these eunuchs were made eunuchs because they removed their testicles. and some were born eunuchs. Now, eunuch doesn't just mean they were born and they didn't have any testicles. They were born and they were not suitable for marriage. Um, I imagine, and I think I might be accurate in this. I might not be, but I really believe this. I think the term eunuch would have been a much broader term, much like we use the word gay. Uh, while we use the word gay specifically for gay men, but we talk about gay women. We also talk about the queer community. Queer is also a blanket term. So the word eunuch would have been more than just talking about uh, male slaves who had had their testicles removed so that they would be gentler, milder, and more controlled. Okay? Uh, Things may or may not have been different with Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We hear about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and we only really remember their Babylonian names. I just read their Hebrew names to you, and I don't remember them. I'd have to go back and look at them here in my notes to get them correct. But we remember their names because of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the story we heard of them. Although I remember in Sunday school, we would have our Sunday school pictures of Daniel being thrown into the den with the lions, and it was always a young Daniel. But actually, uh, that's not accurate. Daniel was an older man, maybe a very old man at the time that he was actually thrown in to the fiery furnace. So with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they would have been taken about the same time. So they probably wouldn't have been around his age. We think that they were young teenagers. So puberty would have already would have already um, uh, hit for these men. We think Daniel was about 14 at the age he was captured. Now, I won't say that they did not castrate males that they captured when they were already into puberty, um, because the scripture even tells us that they were good looking men. They weren't describing them as boys. So puberty had already hit, and I'm thinking puberty had been kind to Daniel. I imagine he was well muscled and he looked good, which is why the king uh, uh, singled him out and specifically requested that these four princes were uh, in his palace and serving him. So, on some level, we might want to say, okay, well, yeah, I mean, he was being trained by the master of the eunuchs, so he must have been made a eunuch because that's where he was. But even though I have some gripes with the modern translations that don't say master of the eunuchs, but they say master of the court officials, well, it's possible not all of the court officials were eunuchs. And maybe all of them were except for Daniel. Or maybe all of them were except for Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Maybe. So while I often have problems with the NIV, and in this case, the NRSV, perhaps they're more accurate by not saying master of the eunuchs, if in fact Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were not made eunuchs by the removal of their testicles. And as we see, by the time Daniel actually entered into the service of the king, the scripture says it was about 3 years. So he would have been about 17 by then. So when we're looking just at male development, a man somewhere between 17 and 22, 23, that's when they really look like young men. They don't look like boys anymore. They're men, and so that's what the king wanted King Nebuchadnezzar wanted in his palace. The Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not want to eat the very good meat and food that was provided to them because it was also offered to the gods. And uh, Daniel and his cousins, I guess, a couple of them, they could have been brothers. All we know is they were the four princes, probably likely to be in line to be the next king. So, uh, not sure if they were all cousins of Daniel's or if one or two of them might have actually been his brothers. I don't know, but Daniel seemed to be the spokesperson for them. Daniel may have been 1 or 2 years older. So Daniel may have been about 17 and the other boys would have been 15, 16, something like that, uh, when they went into service. And Daniel said, we can't eat what's been uh, given as an offering to your idols. I mean, our God would not allow that. So here's what we know. Boys that were 14, 13 would have been very well trained in the Jewish faith and the religion. And the fact that they were princes, they would have been more highly educated than most of the young men their age. And they would have been old enough so that when they went to Babylon and they spent the 3 years being trained, learning learning language and customs and procedures and learning everything they needed to know so that they could be good servants to King Nebuchadnezzar. They were old enough to know who their people were and were able to learn this new stuff without letting that tarnish and influence who they knew they were supposed to be. So Daniel says, we can't do that. Just feed us the vegetables. That's fine. And he said, no, I can't do that because you will lose muscle tone. You won't be as strong. You won't be as good looking. And then the king will be upset with me because I'm supposed to look after you. And Daniel says, no, God will take care of us. The vegetables will be good for us. Now, here's what I know. If they had been made eunuchs by the removal of their testicles, they would have been lacking in testosterone. And if they were 17 when they went into the service of the king, that would have happened when they first arrived at about the age of 14. And at those times, just like when we talked about horses, it's best to geld a horse at one. It was best to castrate and make eunuchs of their male slaves and servants as young as possible, probably 6 or under. So the fact that they would have arrived at 14, they would have done that right away. Now, the age of going from 14, even if puberty had already set in, to being 17, without that testosterone, the facial hair, the muscular shoulder and arms and muscular legs would not have developed as they should, and they would not have stood out as good-looking men. The eunuchs appeared, I hate to use the word effeminate, but compared to a random group of men, they would have appeared less hairy, less muscular, more demure, words that we would describe as more effeminate. So the fact that even at 17, when they were going into service and they were only wanting to eat vegetables, if they were still at that time worried about them losing muscle tone, I tend to be of the impression that maybe they were not made eunuchs by the removal of their testicles. Man, I've never had a podcast where I said testicles so much, but you really can't talk about Daniel without talking about testicles if we're wondering about if Daniel and these boys were made eunuchs. The assumption is they were made eunuchs because they were trained by the person who was the master of all the eunuchs. But some of the English translations say master of the court officials. Did they have to change that name? Because they would not have all been eunuchs if some of them were not. Now, if Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were made eunuchs, yeah, then this man was master of the eunuchs. But somehow it doesn't quite match up. If when we're talking about the appearance of these men, and even when they're 17 and going in, and there's still a concern that they're still muscular and that they look really good, well, they would not be able biologically to maintain that same amount of muscle mass and manliness, if you want to call it that. So perhaps they were not made eunuchs. However, there is nothing in the Bible that leads us to believe one way or the other. The only clues are that they were trained in the Babylonian way of life by the person who in the King James Version says was the master of the eunuchs, which was the person in charge of training and educating, making sure the people that worked and served in the palace of King Nebuchadnezzar had the intelligence and the right look. So the fact that they got these young men after puberty had already started, they may not have done that. Okay? Well, let's kind of look and see at what some of my notes say in here. I really don't want to hash through all of that. It is important to know that these four princes were selected not just because they were princes, but because they were very good-looking young men. It's not describing them as boys. Now, there were some civilization that time who liked the girly-looking men as their servants. That was more popular, though, in the Greek and Roman areas. Here's one of my comments. My heart aches when I think about these boys, young men who were captured. They must have been scared, but they became brave and honorable. You know, how many times do we face things that we don't want to face, but we're not probably as brave as these young men were, or at least in the way they're portrayed in these writings. We're not sure who wrote the book of Daniel. Some people say because of the pattern of the other books that the book of Daniel was written by Daniel, but we don't believe that to be true. We believe the book of Daniel was written by a variety of people, and we're not really sure who those people were. Daniel was 17 years old when he entered the service of the king. Among his gifts was the ability to interpret dreams. He became invaluable to the king. If you want to hear more of my conversation on eunuchs, I've written about that in my other books, like The Christian Response to LGBTQ. There's written on that. It's also in my book that's in the Spanish language, Cristianismo y Orientación Sexual. There's also a section on eunuchs. But in my Deep and Wide book, I talk about that at least one time on page 294 and 295. And I'm using a scripture from Matthew to generate that conversation. And I think this is where I want to wrap this up. Where he talked about in the lion's den, he probably was about 80 years old at that time. So the pictures we have in Sunday school aren't really accurate. I'm going to close with just a few paragraphs here. And this is following the 10 days where they said they would only eat vegetables instead of the royal food. And they came out looking healthier and better nourished. The story of what they ate provides some important information. Ashpenaz knew that the king had high expectations of the four princes of Judah. They had to look better than the rest of the servants and slaves. Although customary to remove the testicles of their slaves, this may not have been done to the four princes. When the testicles are removed, there is a lack of testosterone in the body. A male without testosterone will lose muscle mass and will be more easily tired. Because of the importance of these captured royalty appearing fit and healthy, they may not have become eunuchs surgically after their captures. Daniel never married and was in the service of many of the kings of Babylon. What became of Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, who we know as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, is not certain. We know about them at the beginning of Daniel's story and a brief episode with the fiery furnace, but not much else. Daniel may have been a eunuch, either born or made, but there is not sufficient evidence to support a conclusion on the subject. It doesn't really matter. Did you hear that? It doesn't really matter. The sexual abilities or inabilities, inclinations, or interest of a person are not important in who the person is in the world. These details are not significant, even if we are curious. Some people have sexual interest and some people do not. Some people have conditions that impact their interest and limitations, and some people do not. Some people's inclinations align with the majority, and some do not. Daniel was a good man. He remembered his training early on. Even though the kingdom of Judah was not perfect, as a young man up to about 14 years of age, he would have been trained specifically in the right theology of their time and the good things about their people, the kingdom of Judah. And at 14, he would not yet have been old enough to be tarnished by the bad things in the kingdom of Judah, which there were plenty of those things. And so when he went off to Babylon and was being trained in all the Babylonian stuff, he was a very smart, intelligent person, and he was able to take that and learn all that without that impacting and tarnishing that which he already knew to be the truth. And he stuck to what he knew was right in what had to be an extremely scary, terrible situation at 14 years of age to be captured and taken someplace where he did not even know, and then being assimilated into the service of King Nebuchadnezzar. He had to be extremely scared and frightened, but yet in the face of that was brave, adjusted to the situation with which he found himself, and still stayed true to what he knew was right. And he made a difference. He made a difference. People noticed. People noticed the stand he made, standing up for right, even when there could have been terrible consequences. But people noticed. They noticed that he was good, and his gifts of interpreting dreams became very valuable to the king. So at some point, hopefully, the king had some impact on King Nebuchadnezzar. I don't know. Clearly, uh, uh, a later king of Babylon did allow the people of Judah to go back. So, did Daniel have any part in that? As that played down the way in the history? Did King Nebuchadnezzar's like and value and honor that he found in Daniel, did that transfer to the people of the kingdom of Judah? And then that passed down to a subsequent king? Maybe. We really don't have any way of knowing, but I kind of would like to think that it did. Because I live in a world that's upside down right now. But I have to believe that I live in a world where doing the right thing matters and it will make a positive impact. I may not see it, but that doesn't mean doing the right thing didn't matter. Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to this podcast. Thank you.